right, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the 11 a.m. session with speaker Megan Metler, titled The History of Selma, What's Fact and Fiction. Dr. Megan Metler is the Assistant Dean of Academic Affairs at Upper Iowa University and until recently served as an Associate Professor of History. Her research centers on U.S. international relations during the Cold War, especially cultural relations between the United States and Japan. In 2018, she published her first book, How to Reach Japan by Subway, America's Fascination with Japanese Culture from 1945 to 1965, which analyzes how middle-class Americans consumers embraced Japanese culture in the wake of World War II. She has taught numerous courses spanning the length of the American history throughout her time at Upper Iowa. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Megan Metler.
So thank you all. It's nice to be here this morning. And yeah, I will not be talking about Japan today, but talking quite a bit about the United States. And yeah, as Nicole said towards the end, I have taught pretty much the entire scope of U.S. history in my time at Upper Iowa, including the civil rights movement, which is what I'm here to talk about this morning. And also, yeah, kind of talking about the civil rights movement and introducing this movie, Selma, which will be shown in here or just streaming somewhere starting at noon. So this is kind of an introduction to the movie. And I'm putting together this presentation. I was asked to talk about sort of like the fact versus fiction, what is fact, what is myth in this movie. But in thinking about that, first of all, I wanted to address the question of just factuality in movies more generally, because it is kind of a complicated issue. Like, you really can't go in fairly and grade a movie just like, oh, does this movie tell the truth? Is it factual? Is it not? Because movies based on historical events, they're always going to stretch the truth. They're going to exaggerate. They're going to move things around. They kind of have to. Because when you make a movie that you actually want people to go see, like, it has to have like a narrative arc. Like, it has to be interesting. It has to tell a good story. And real life doesn't always necessarily tell a good story. Stuff happens in real life that's, you know, kind of a slog. It's not quite as interesting. So they'll cut corners here, move things around there to make a better story. And they have to do that. And we have to kind of excuse them for it. So the question I don't want to answer, I mean, what I don't want to answer here with Selma is it factual or not? Because it's not 100% factual. But the question is the sort of exaggerations and stretching the truth that it does, what is that in the service of, and does it have more benefit than harm? So really, what we should be doing when thinking about whether movies are factual or not, we just have to accept that they're not factual and then kind of run a cost-benefit analysis in terms of that. So I want to do just a few of those to start off with here for Selma. And so you can see, excuse me. All right, so there we have, of course, on the left is the actual Dr. Martin Luther King, and on the right is the actor David Oyelowo, who plays King in the movie. So there we have, yeah, fact versus fiction. So an example of a fact that gets kind of altered in the movie that you'll see, you know, if you watch the movie very early on, is the timing of the bombing of the Birmingham church. Because the editing in the movie makes it seem like this church in Birmingham, Alabama gets bombed while King is accepting his Nobel Peace Prize. When in actuality, that bombing occurred a year before King's Nobel Peace Prize. So then the question is, all right, so that's, you know, not exactly factual. Why do the filmmakers choose to do it? You will see in the movie because the juxtaposition is very powerful, very affecting for them to do that. And at the same time, then what is the harm in moving the Birmingham bombing like forward in time 1 year? Well, in terms of like people's understanding of the civil rights movement, just, you know, thinking it happened in 65 instead of 64 isn't going to make that big a dent in your overall understanding of civil rights. So that's the kind of thing I think we could give the filmmakers a pass on. There's some other examples, you know, get a little more complicated. One other thing that happens in Selma that is not factual is that Dr. King sits out the first march on the Edmund Pettus Bridge because he is experiencing marital difficulties. Now, this is kind of, again, it's true stuff that happened, but the timing gets moved around. King really did sit out the first march. he really was experiencing marital difficulties. He really did have affairs with other women that, quite understandably, caused tension in his marriage. But in actuality, he sat out the march because of logistical reasons. But those are not very interesting to show on film. And also, the filmmakers wanted to portray King as more human and, include his troubled marriage. So we just kind of take out the boring stuff, stick the more interesting stuff we need to fit in somewhere into that same time frame. So again, it's two truthful things, but the sequencing isn't exactly right. That's another kind of thing where I think we can still give him a pass because, it doesn't really harm your understanding of King or civil rights all that much. And then one last thing sort of worth mentioning, and where we're just doing the basic fact checking, is, and this is one we cannot blame the filmmakers for at all the speeches in here are basically made up. None of them are actual speeches that King gave, and there's a very direct reason for that. It's that Martin Luther King's estate is very, very protective of the copyright of his speeches. So they would not allow the filmmakers to use any of King's actual words. So the scriptwriters had to go and write basically new speeches for Martin Luther King that kind of captured the essence of what he was trying to say, sort of the charisma that he brought to the room, but they could not be word for word from what he had said, or else the filmmakers would have gotten sued. And this last example, I think, kind of leads to a nice segue to a larger point about the idea of having movies be totally accurate or not. Really, what doesn't matter so much is the exact words by the letter. Are they completely 100% precisely truthful, or do they capture the overall essence, sort of the feeling of that time, the people, the emotions, the politics, the ideas, just what was in the air in the mid-1960s in terms of the civil rights movement. And most critics and historians agree that this film does that. So yes, there's going to be a few things here and there that are not 100% factually correct with Selma, but overall, the basic tenor of the time, it is pretty truthful to what was going on. So that's just a thing to keep in mind watching the movie and hearing me talk a little bit more about it now. So what I'm going to do now is, first of all, kind of get out of the way another area where Selma often gets criticized for being inaccurate, but then talk also about things that it does do accurately, things that it points out about the civil rights movement that most people don't think of, aren't aware of, don't know as well, so that are worth pointing out and bearing in mind watching the film. So the first thing, in terms of inaccuracies, the big thing to get out of the way is the one that got the most press when the movie was released, and that is its depiction of Lyndon Johnson. So there were both professional historians and journalists alike just laid into this movie when it first came out about being unfair to Johnson. So the way that President Johnson is portrayed here, you can kind of see from this image, he's pretty antagonistic towards King. His character is in the movie. They fight a lot about the Voting Rights Act and trying to get it passed, and they're, often at odds. When in fact, in real life, Johnson was a pretty strong supporter of the civil rights movement. He and King got along very well. He also supported the tactics of the movement. He had no problem with them going down to Selma and staging these protests. The character in the movie at some point grumbles about people having a damn liberal conscience. But the real life Johnson probably would fully readily admit that he himself had a pretty strong liberal conscience, and he was on the side of civil rights. And so a lot of historians who wrote about Johnson, they were kind of up in arms over this, feeling like he was being portrayed unfairly, sort of as kind of an antagonist, an enemy towards King here. Now, one other thing I will mention, they did argue. It's not like they always got along all the time. And the movie does portrays them arguing about the timing of the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Johnson wanted to work on his other Great Society programs, get them through Congress first, not the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, wanted to take care of other business first before King tried to push forward the Voting Rights Act, and King was trying to get Johnson to move faster on that. But those conversations in real life were a lot more cordial than how they're portrayed in the movie. So then the question is, all right, so Johnson, and clearly, yes, it was very easily fact-checked that this is an inaccurate portrayal of Johnson, so why do it? Well, there's a number of reasons why it works out to have Johnson as kind of a bad guy in the movie. And the first of these is something I've already mentioned, which is telling a good story. So to kind of have Johnson as this antagonist figure to King's protagonist, it's sort of how people generally digest narratives. It makes sense to sort of, it creates dramatic tension to have him on the other side, playing off of King in that way. And also, I don't think it's a spoiler that Johnson, by the end of the movie, sees the light and comes around. And of course, obviously, he signed off on the Voting Rights Act of 1965, so he had to have. But kind of giving him that redemptive narrative arc is also something that helps the story and get the filmmakers' points across. Also, a way that sort of Johnson as bad guy gets used in this is the two of them then get to have these dialogues, the character King and the character Johnson, talking about very simple basic stuff related to the Voting Rights Act that the two of these guys, historical figures, would have known, but audiences don't always necessarily. So having them argue gets a chance to have them deliver exposition, just explain what was the status of voting rights for African Americans in 1965. Both of them would have known that, but having that back and forth gets to get viewers up to speed when they're watching the film. So there's another reason to have them argue so much. And then finally, I think this movie was released in this atmosphere of a lot of criticism of other movies of having white saviors. And so I think one of the things the filmmakers are trying to do here as well is avoid that kind of white savior trap with President Johnson. They wanted to make very clear that it was King and other African-American activists who got the Voting Rights Act passed, and didn't want to make it look like, okay, here's Johnson stepping in to grant them voting rights as the benevolent white president. So I think on balance, this is another thing. It's like you can understand why they did it, basically give them a pass, as long as you kind of know in the back of your mind it isn't 100% accurate. And one other thing I will mention, yes, please keep in the back of your mind, there is a scene here where Johnson decides to blackmail King using the FBI. He never would have done that ever in real life. And I think that's the one fact check where I'm like, that is a little bit unfair to have him do that. But yeah, so just kind of keep in mind, they're a little rough on Johnson in this. So then, yeah, what is the harm in that? A lot of people tend to think not too much, excuse me. I would agree with them. Johnson's still going to be known as the president who passed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and sort of on the right side of history in terms of civil rights. So for the most part, yeah, it's like I think this is, it's fine that they exaggerate his character a little bit. But I did read one essay that kind of had an intriguing argument about this matter that said there was kind of a missed opportunity in not having Johnson work closer with King, because it would have been really interesting to see a president working hand in hand with a radical movement leader. Because one of the things we forget today is how radical King and the civil rights movement were considered at that point in time. We have a holiday for Martin Luther King. We're here today. He's kind of accepted as an important figure now. But in 1965, a lot of people, thought he went too far. They thought he was trouble. They thought he was dangerous. So kind of like an equivalent today would be maybe if, President Joe Biden, instead of if he embraced the defund the police movement instead of trying to distance himself from them. Sort of more radical, what's viewed as more radical aspects of civil rights today, that was kind of be the equivalent of what Johnson was doing, working with King. And it would be interesting to see a movie that kind of showed a president working with a radical leader like that. But of course, that's a lot harder to do than have Johnson play the villain and sort of the classic, basic, standard narrative trope. So that's what the filmmakers did. And it's just, a thing to be aware of as you watch it. But for the most part, as I said before, this movie is pretty accurate, especially when we're talking about the time in general. Which is why I want to move on to some of the accuracies that I want to emphasize in this movie, things that, not everybody doesn't always necessarily think about or is aware of in terms of the civil rights movement. And the first of these, the movie does a great job of showing the strategies behind the movement. And I don't really recognize any former students here before, but I've said this in classrooms many times. The civil rights movement, nonviolent protest, yes, it was morally the right thing to do, but it wasn't just morally the right thing to do. It was also brilliant strategy. It worked really, really well for getting accomplished what they wanted to accomplish. And the strategy behind it is that if you go forward as nonviolent protests and you're not armed and you're not angry and you're not resisting arrest, then you look sort of blameless. You look like mostly law-abiding in everything but refusing to abide by segregation. In contrast, when law enforcement comes in and attacks those nonviolent protesters with nightsticks, which I guess, projector's not the best, but you can kind of see, he's got a baton there. He's about to bash Oprah Winfrey in this picture. But yeah, when they sort of manhandle protesters, when they beat them up, when they turn fire hoses and dogs on them, it makes law enforcement, Southern law enforcement, looks like absolute brutes. So if you use nonviolent protest, you make your side look really good, you make the other side look horrible, and it is very, very effective. Because you think about people who are sort of just bystanders, kind of neutral parties, watching events unfold in the South in the 1960s, you like white people in the North just see this on their televisions. It's hard to continue to support or to be on the side of segregationists when the segregationists are brutalizing innocent protesters. So it's a very, very good, effective strategy. So it's not just the right thing to do, it's the very smart thing to do. And one of the things the movie shows is not just, how all this works in practice, because you have these scenes of police brutality at Selma. The movie also is great is it shows white people in the North watching their TVs and their reactions. But it also shows the movement's leadership talking about these strategies. There's dialogue here that is very explicit. Like, this is what they are trying to do. You'll see a scene with a group of leaders. One of them is explaining why they had to leave the town of Albany, Alabama, because their sheriff, quote, kept his cool and there was no drama. And one of the other leaders responds, "Oh, you mean there were no cameras?" And the first guy said, "Exactly. Like, you need to have the law enforcement be brutal, play their role in the whole show as well. And then the media shows up, then the press shows up, then people pay attention. And this is very intentional. And the movie does a great job of showing that. There's kind of a joke line in here. King gets assaulted when he first shows up in Selma, and he says that white boy can hit. And one of his colleagues says, "Great, this place is perfect." So yeah, they are in Selma intentionally to drum up trouble, and it works very well. So that's one thing, that this movie depicts is that, the strategies behind the movement. And then kind of along similar lines, it also shows where the movement leaders differ. So there's also, you'll see disagreements in here between the SCLC and SNCC. And when I just throw out those acronyms, you may or may not know what I'm talking about. So the SCLC was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that was made up of a group of black ministers fighting for civil rights, which King himself was part of. And then SNCC is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which, as the name implies, was Southern college students who were also working for civil rights. And at times the group, they agreed on their overall goals, but they often disagreed in terms of strategies and tactics. And you'll see leaders of both those organizations arguing pretty heatedly about those tactics. And SNCC tended to concentrate on more grassroots local organizing, while the SCLC was the ones who would court the cameras and the national attention and get the media and all this other stuff. And SNCC, one of the SNCC leaders in this movie, kind of rightfully and understandably accuses SCLC of coming in like somewhere they've been working for a while, and then the SCLC comes in and sort of brings all their cameras and gets all the publicity and gets a lot of the credit. And so there were tension between these groups because of things like that. And so I think what this shows us that is good is we tend to think of the civil rights movement as, okay, here's Martin Luther King and all these other guys who worked with him. But it was actually groups of organizations with leadership that had to make decisions, that had meetings, that took minutes, that, groups of people, together in these groups are these institutions that kind of function like any other. And they argued about stuff. They were human beings. They were not always united on exactly what to do, what their next steps were going to be. And so in sort of making the movement more complex and more human, that's another thing that this movie does a great job of doing. It's kind of all that taken together, I think, sort of showing there's people behind the civil rights movement and they're thinking about what they're doing and they're arguing about what they're doing is something really great that this movie shows about the time, and that is a good takeaway from this film. And then sort of the last section of this introduction here, I'm going to talk about some things the movie touches on but doesn't really emphasize and maybe could do a little more. So one of those things is the presence of female activists. So another thing I think, like when people picture the civil rights movement too, is I said, Martin Luther King and all the rest usually pictured as black men. So yes, there were female activists, there were women at the leadership, participating in this decision-making process as well. So you get to see them in the movie, you get to learn their names, it sort of helps preserve them for history. I have seen criticism though, that the women weren't given enough backstory, that they're not shown enough of them in here. But I would sort of defend that by saying that, I don't know, like my observation of this movie, it seems like most of the activists, unless they're John Lewis, actually don't get much of a backstory. In fact, I think might be a criticism of this movie is it tries to cram too many activists in here. You find out their names, but not much else. They're just kind of there. And you don't really know, who are these guys? Where are they coming from? What's going on? But I guess it's better to meet them than not at all. So you do get a lot of the figures in this movement are included, but you don't get a ton more about them. And the women in particular, they're just kind of there. But they are there, so that's credit for that. And then another element to mention that is touched on here but not really developed is King's socialism. His turn towards socialism. And I don't have him here, pictured in his police photo because socialism was illegal in the United States. Rather, just to remind people that, King was a radical, as I mentioned earlier. And this is a thing to keep in mind with the civil rights movement. He did break the law, and he did go to jail for it, and he does that in this movie. And I also should note as well, when I say King is a socialist, and you probably wouldn't be surprised to hear that, he was more a socialist in like the Bernie Sanders mode of socialism than the Joseph Stalin mode of socialism. Really, we're talking about, wanting to redistribute wealth and focusing on socioeconomic issues. And he was giving speeches around this point in time when Selma occurred, calling for a revolution in values to create a better distribution of wealth for all God's children. So basically kind of getting into, these socioeconomic issues. So, he had focused on, up until, 1964 Civil Rights Act, the issue of segregation. That becomes illegal. 1965, makes headway on voting rights. Where's the next logical place to go? Socioeconomic rights and equality. So, yes, he does take this turn more towards socialism in the mid-1960s. And you see this touched upon in the movie briefly. He has a conversation with Ralph Abernathy while in jail, where he starts talking about, we need to work on the economic issues. That should be our next step. After all this happened at Selma, and it's not surprising this isn't depicted in the movie because it happened after Selma, his next campaign after voting rights was to go to Chicago and launch a campaign known as the Chicago Freedom Movement, which focused on economic issues like jobs and housing and strengthening unions, better working conditions and pay, and was just really, more socioeconomically geared. And then when he was assassinated in 1968, the reason he was in Memphis is because he was marching with a sanitation workers union. And their protests were, again, primarily for socioeconomic issues, better pay, better working conditions versus civil rights directly per se. So King really was getting more involved in those sort of social issues. Like I said, that there's not a lot of this in the movie makes sense because a lot of it did happen following Selma. But one thing I would like to note, since I do have the opportunity to introduce this movie, King's socialism, though, is important a little bit to the story in this movie because it's the reason why the FBI was tracking him. So it's very prominent in this film. You'll see, notes from the FBI files. They were following King everywhere. They tapped his phone. They, were bugging the churches where he was giving events, stuff like that. But the FBI was keeping pretty close tabs on King by 1965. And the movie doesn't really explain why that happened. I guess they sort of leave it to audiences to just assume that, he was viewed as a troublemaker and probably also that J. Edgar Hoover was racist on some level. But in actuality, the main reason King was being tracked was because not so much that Hoover was racist, and I don't even know how racist Hoover was, but because Hoover was over the top anti-communist. So the head of the FBI thought that King was maybe going to start talking to the Russians because he was sounding socialist. And that's why the FBI has all these files on him. That's why you see in here the FBI blackmailing him, which actually I could go down a whole rabbit hole of fact versus fiction on the whole FBI blackmailing King. There's nothing to support definitely that happened, but there's also nothing out there to deny that it didn't happen. And it is kind of in keeping with something that Hoover might have done. So he does get in trouble for we see him being in trouble for his socialism in this movie, but it's not really explained. That's why that's happening. And so, yeah, I was going to throw that there as well in terms of explanation. So I feel like I've gone on for a while here about, fact-checking, fact versus fiction in this movie, but, I've thrown out a lot of stuff that's inaccurate, talked about a lot of stuff it does well, and I would say, when we balance both of these sides, overall, this movie does a really good job of being true to the time period and portraying the events accurately in that sense. If you are aware of the places where the movie exaggerates, moves stuff around, stretches the truth, and just think about, what's the look, the feel, the emotions of the time, it gets that pretty right. And you can trust the movie in terms of the overall feel of the era. And also, I think it does deserve credit for the things I mentioned before, humanizing Dr. King, showing his personal struggles behind the scenes, which were all real. And showing those disagreements within the movement, showing the strategizing within the movement, and just making it clear that this was a complex movement with human beings involved, not just some, hero of Dr. Martin Luther King, but actual people making this change in the mid-1960s. And for that, I'd say, Selma is a good movie to watch to get a sense of the civil rights movement. And I hope you guys do watch it at some point today and learn a lot from it. So that is what I have to say to introduce this movie. I will now open the floor for questions if there are any. Yes. Oh, okay. So the question was, I think I heard that is there a movie that reflects the civil rights movement that does a poor job that I am aware of? And so what's interesting with Selma is it was really the first time anybody made a movie about Dr. King where he was like a significant central character. Like there may have been other movies where like people watched him giving a speech or something, but this was the first time anybody ever attempted to do that. Because I guess it had been seen for a while as almost like sacrilegious to have like an actor try to be Martin Luther King. So in that sense, it's like there's no other movie like this to say like it was bad, and you would hope, and luckily it was, that when they did make this, they put a lot of effort into trying to be accurate overall to Dr. King. I mean, like I said, I talked all about how Johnson's exaggerated, but King is pretty accurate, the portrayal there. I personally, I mean, like. I mean, for this time period, I can't think of, just in general, like movies that do a horrible job of civil rights, like there's Birth of a Nation, which is like the classic, but that's the Civil War. I honestly, and I don't know if it's just there's a lack of, it's my ignorance or there's just a lack of movies out there that portray the civil rights movement. I'm just like, John Waters' Hairspray does a great job as well. I don't know. I mean, and actually might open this to the floor. Can anyone think of other movies that kind of capture the civil rights movement at this time period? Because I'm drawing blanks. So, yeah. You're going to have to help me with which events in Detroit. Yeah, I think so. So a lot of those riots, and I'd have to double check on Detroit, but a lot of them actually happened when King was assassinated in 1968. So I know, Baltimore, that they had major riots for like a week after King died, and so Detroit, I would maybe guess, was part of that wave as well. The only one that was like happened before King's death that I can think off the top of my head was the Watts riot. That took place in 1965. So that was around the time of Selma. And Watts, which is in Los Angeles, was kind of considered like the first major like race riot kind of the modern era. There were a lot of race riots like around World War I, but that was, the first big one of the civil rights movement was in Watts in 65. And in 68, after King's assassination, there's a whole wave of them. And I don't know if you were Googling that or yes. In 1970. Oh, okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm not like an expert on that, but I do know, yes, the FBI kept very close tabs on, yeah, on the Black Panthers and any other kind of the Black militants movements. Yeah, then in '65 there was not a lot of that going on yet, but yeah, by the end of the late 1960s, those groups definitely existed, and yes, the FBI was very closely monitored them, and I'm pretty sure, but not 100%, that they would, send like agents undercover to like infiltrate them. And I feel like there might be a movie out there that depicts that. Oh, wait, what was the one? Oh, no, no, no. Black Clans was the other way. The one that just came out about the guy who, huh? Yeah, Judas and the Black Messiah. Yeah, so that's kind of because that guy was like an FBI informant who was working with one of the Black militant groups in the early '70s. So yeah, whoever said that, kudos to that. But yeah, Judas and the Black Messiah is a portrayal of that. So it was even worse what went on with the Black Power movements later. That was the other term I'm trying to find, was we had Black Power movements. So yeah, so that was pretty bad. And actually, one other thing I'll throw out there too, in comparison, not with other Black groups, but other people that J. Edgar Hoover went after because he suspected they were communists, was Charlie Chaplin was another one that Hoover thought was a socialist and had a file on for that reason. There was a playwright to Edward Albee, I think he also went after, thinking he was a socialist. And I used to have lecture notes on the 1950s where I had a whole list of guys that Hoover went after, and King was just kind of a throwaway line as part of that. But yeah, there were a lot of people in the public eye that Hoover is like, this guy's a commie. And so yeah, I don't know if it takes away to say King was not all that special, and being pursued by J. Edgar Hoover for that reason. But yeah, that's kind of what was going on with that. I do find it interesting. I don't quite know how to explain that. Like, you would think that they would want those out there. And I do, like, I mean, I've taught history from textbooks that feature, that have the speech, a transcript. So I think it's like they very tightly control who gets it. It's not like they never let anybody use it, because they let textbook companies use it. But I think they're like, ooh, Hollywood movie. Like, maybe they were worried about the depiction or something. I don't know. But yeah, why they refuse to let them use the speeches, it seems that's maybe a little tighter than they needed to be, because that would have been cool if they had allowed that. Yeah. Any other questions? Does anybody online have anything? Or oh, we don't have that going. Okay, that's right. You said that. Okay. So, okay. Well, thank you all for